That'll be PMG 511A. The integrated processes will be there. So they all up. Michelle, you just look at your hand. Michelle. Okay. So what we have today, good evening Carlos as well. I see you just joined us just at the start. So we're just about ready to go. So welcome this evening to Manage Project Scope. The last one took me just an hour, so hopefully we can get through the same tonight. This one on our second session. Great. Let's get going. There's the scope of the project to climb the mountain, and we don't know what's around the next corner. So here is scope management. Really, what we're trying to do tonight is to manage that peak. What is it that we have to do to get to the peak, and what's around the corner? We're going to have to try and estimate what's coming around the corner. Most of what I'm giving you tonight and the terminology that we're using within these sessions is the vocabulary that is used in the PM book. So the vocabulary that we use here is there. So if you don't understand some of the terminology that we have, please just stop me and we will define that terminology, because most of it is used within PMI. So it's project management speak, if you like. Right, what we're doing tonight in scope management is really those the scope planning, the scope definition, the create a work breakdown structure, scope verification, scope control. So the first three about the scope is really the planning part of it. Now, it shows you the importance it is as a technique and a method and a tool for us managing the project is the scope. If we do the scope planning right, if we do the scope definition, the work breakdown structure correctly, we will certainly have a scope that is verifiable and a scope that we can actually control. Remember, I talked about scope creep. Scope creep is really because we haven't done a good enough job on scope planning and definition. So that's what we're looking at tonight. What is it that we need to do? Some of the tools and techniques for scope planning, definition, and creating the work breakdown structure. Now, here we have the inputs. Remember, we talked about the process, and we had those 5 process groups, which you saw on the top of that one. And what we have here are some of the inputs that go into the scope statement, if you like, or the final scope management plan, which will affect also the project management plan. And we have the organizational process assets and enterprise environmental factors. Is anybody going to hazard a guess what those two things mean? What is enterprise environmental factors and what is organizational process assets? Would you like to just hazard a guess tonight? Somebody define those two terms for me. The reason why I'm asking this is because it's two areas that are quite important in the assessment and the project management assessment. It's two terms that come up again and again in the project management guide. So can anybody tell me what operational process assets? What does it include? What are the operational process assets? Oh, nobody's going to take it. Should I give you? Okay, if you want me to give you the definition, would you like the definition? Yes, Dodie's got it right. They are the organizational process assets. Is really got to do with your policies, your procedures, your systems, and that type of thing. So, what would environmental factors be? Enterprise environmental factors. What would that entail? Enterprise environmental factors. It's an input into our process here. Anybody has a guess at that? Okay. If there's no one coming forward, I'm going to just read the definition to you. An enterprise environmental factor is any or all the external environmental factors, internal organizational environmental factors, that surround or influence the project success. Okay? These factors are from any or all the enterprises involved in the project. Include your organizational culture, the structure, the infrastructure, the existing resources, the commercial databases, marketing conditions, and the project management software. So all of these can actually do that. So that's what it is. So those are the factors that you're going to take into consideration when you're doing your project scope management. And so those two are very important. Obviously, your project, when we're doing scope planning, your project charter comes into effect here. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we come into this. We're looking at scope planning. Your preliminary scope statements will be already been defined within your project charter. It's already been defined. So scope planning, it's the detailed planning of your project. It's still in the preliminary phase of your project, but it is the detailed part of it. Sustainability, yes, that also comes into, thanks Carlos, that also comes into your environmental enterprise factors. Look about sustainability. Sustainability is not only environmental sustainability, it's also when you put it back into the enterprise, is it sustainable? So often we look at that from communities when we're doing community planning as well. Is the project sustainable within the community? So that's another environmental factor. Thank you, Carlos. I hope I got what you were saying. Right. All right, next part for this one would be, let's look at some of the tools. In scope planning, there are often templates and standards that are required by an organization. If you're a functional organization, you're not going to get too many of those from the template forms and standards. So it's very good to go to and look around for some of those. And obviously the most important one is the project methodology itself. Now remember, scope planning is part of your project methodology, and it is the tool that you're going to use all the way through the project to ensure that you meet your success. If you've done your scope planning correctly, it is a wonderful tool to manage the implementation of your project. When it comes down to scope definition is part of your planning. And what do we mean by scope definition? Your scope definition now takes your scope management plan, it takes your approved change requests and your enterprise environmental factors and your preliminary scope and your project charter, and you're going to come out with a scope statement, requested changes, and scope management change. So somebody asked me, well, why do we do it now? Why do we have in your scope definition, why do we have requested changes already? Well, between the project initiation or your project charter and your project planning, it's going to often see that we're going to get changes. When you start defining and you start narrowing down and you start looking at some of the things that are going to impact your project in your detailed planning, it's obvious that you're going to get changes to your project charter. And those need to be approved. So who approves those? Obviously, at this stage of the plan, it is your project client that's going to change those. Right? So we're looking at your project client making those change requests. And you if you're in your project planning phase, there will be iterations of this. Because as you become clearer and clearer and identify your scope, and as it becomes clearer and clearer exactly what your objectives are on your project scope, your project charter is going to change as well. And it's your client that signs off on your project charter. That's where we are on that one. Let's go on a little bit and let's look at some of the tools in your scope definition. So here's some of them. Obviously, it's really important to do a stakeholder analysis. There are some templates that I've provided for that scope stakeholder analysis and some of the things there for it. And the second part is your product analysis. And then you're going to look for alternative identification. Is there another way of doing this? It's in this definition phase that you start looking for alternatives and you start making and you say, well, what happens if? And is there an alternative? So at this stage, you're going to look at alternatives and you're going to try and identify alternative ways of doing things. It's at this stage that your team, your project team, really needs to be effective, because, like I said, you've got a mountain. You don't know what's going to be there or around the corner in this one, and you're going to have to make some sort of professional judgment. You're going to have to make some sort of expert judgment, because this is future. Remember, I said that most projects, the reason for a project is that one of the characteristics of a project is that there are a lot of unknowns in it. So what we're looking at here is to look at that. Now, the product analysis is concerned with how the work will be done, not what's in it. Okay? How the work will be done, not what's in it. And that's the difference between a requirements analysis and a product analysis. Requirements analysis has got to do with what has got to be done. Okay? So a product analysis is how the work will be done. It overwrote on here a little bit, and I never noticed that. So scope is not preliminary anymore. Understand, when we come down to your definition, your products, your scope definition, at this stage, it's no longer preliminary. Come out of this, you've got what you're going to be using as a baseline for the rest of your project. So what are some of the problems that we're going to have? What are some of the things that we can do? Well, the first thing that we have in scope management, and it is really essential, is boundaries. Now, I asked someone early on this evening, I said, can anybody tell me, what do we mean by boundaries of a project? Anybody give me some idea? Come on, give me a hazarded guess at what are the boundaries of a project. Give me a scenario of a boundary in a project. Because when we're defining it, what's the difference between a boundary and an objective or a deliverable? What are the boundaries in a project? What I tried to mention in what a boundary possibly could be in a construction one, if you're constructing a road, and one of the issues comes back to revegetation. Now, is revegetation part of the project or not? Okay, so you've dug up the side of the road and you need to restore it to what it was. Is that part of the project or not? It's a fuzzy area. In other words, certainly your stakeholders, so people living in the area, will say, hey, that needs to be part of the project. Right? But the construction company says that's not our experience. So we're going to assume that the boundary for us is that we will put it back to this state and somebody else has to do the revegetation. So it needs to be cleared up front. So in your scope management, when you're defining your scope, boundaries are very important to set. Is this in the project or is it out of the project? And setting exclusions in the project is the tool that you need to do. So a project manager must try and push those boundaries. In other words, make sure that there's clarity on boundaries. Defining and managing a project scope will influence the overall success of the project. Okay, so I'm back to this one, and my question is going to be the same. Carlos has put some things in here. Budget and limits. Yes, budgets and limits are important in boundaries. What is the boundary and what is the limit? How far do we go? So, can anybody tell me the difference now, after what we've just said, of the difference between an objective, a boundary, and a deliverable? What are you going to help me out here? What's the difference between an objective? Yes, Anthony has raised his hand. Anthony, I've given you the microphone, Anthony. Can you give us, can you tell us what you believe the difference would be?
I would say an objective is your forecasted deliverable. Your boundary is the perimeters or the overall scope that you want to deliver. And the deliverables are you trying to manage what you've set out to achieve as part of your objectives and your boundaries.
Okay, I think that's fair. I think it's quite a good answer. I would like to define objectives slightly different from a deliverable in this respect. Is the objective is your alignment to your strategic direction of the organization that you're taking this in. Whether it's product development or whether your project is doing developing a product, whether it's changing processes within your organization or systems within your organization, there should be some sort of alignment to the strategy of the organization. Your projects have got, your objectives have got to do that. If you've met that and you can put it back into the business, those objectives need to be met. So in other words, it's met business objectives. Now, deliverables are actually the product that you're going to deliver or the service that you're going to deliver. So when you sign off, and we're going to look at some of these tools right now, when you sign off, you're going to sign off on a deliverable. When you come to a phase, you might meet a particular objective of that phase. The boundaries of exactly what you said, it's the limit. It's the limit of what we're going to do there. Good. Now, let's go to this one. Why? So a good way to look at a project objective is to ask this question: why are we doing this project? So an objective should be answering your motivation to do this project. Okay, so projects must be specific, measurable. And what are the other ones? A, can anybody remember from the SMART A? Achievable, right? SMART must be specific, measurable. It must be achievable. R, anybody can remember what R is from SMART? Was it realistic? And T is time bound or time framed. Oh, nobody can help me with the R. Okay. Please help me with the R. What was the R for in SMART? To assist us in defining the objectives, we use the following questions as well. We also ask who, what, when, and how much. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. And let's look at project deliverables. So there are many deliverables from projects, and organizations usually have templates established to ensure that those deliverables are there and they're not forgotten. Okay, so there are a lot of deliverables. Your work package, each little work package, if you like, when we come to the work breakdown package, has got a deliverable. So deliverables are very important. So deliverables can include such things as specification documents, the design documents, the rollout plans, the training manuals, the project scope statement is a deliverable. So when I come to my client and I've got my project scope statement and I want it signed off, it is actually a deliverable. Project deliverables are also deliverables as well as the product or service that we're doing. So when we specify what has to be done, that document needs to be signed off, or it is a deliverable of the project, even if it's in the first part of the project. The design documents are products. So rollout plans. Okay, how this is actually going to roll out. Training manuals are all deliverables. So it might either be part of the structure or actually part of the content of the project. Now, when we look at the scope project statement, what is included in a project scope statement? Okay, this is what it is. You should have objectives. That helps you align to your strategic objectives of the organization. There should be a scope description. Now that scope description is like an abstract. It should be able to be very clear from there that you can get an overall idea of what this project is about in a very brief way. So a few paragraphs or so should be able to describe what you're actually doing in your project. Project requirements, what is required of the project, the boundaries, the deliverables, the acceptance criteria. Now this is what I want to say in your scope statement. If you do not have acceptance criteria and you don't define that acceptance criteria up front, remember this becomes a tool to be able to manage it. Now let me try and give you an idea. It wasn't long ago and I asked how many people work for functional organizations, and most of you put up your hand. Now what's going to happen in a functional organization is you're going to come to the end of a phase of a project and you want to get it signed off. If you have not properly done acceptance criteria for that sign off, what you can actually find is that you're going to get a whole lot of arguments for why this phase cannot be signed off. I don't know whether you've ever heard of buyer's remorse. Well, clients get project remorse. They start a project, they put up all the project money for it, the sponsor gives them the money for it, and you're in the thing and you get to your first phase, and suddenly the client says, man, I'm not sure we really should have done this project or not. And you come to your first phase and you want to get it signed off, and you haven't done your acceptance criteria properly, and he's going to hum and haw about signing it off. And what that's going to do is it's going to affect the rest of the project, because it's quite possible that that will cause delays in continuing the project. And your client himself is actually going to do that. Now, you say, well, where does that influence come from? It comes from the stakeholders. Okay, the stakeholders are going to put a lot of pressure on your client to ensure that this is the right thing to do for the organization. So acceptance criteria, get agreement up front on what is acceptable. So if that criteria is there, then it's fairly easy. You can tick it off, and you must make it easy to say yes or no. This is one place that you make things very easy. You make it easy to say yes, this is achieved, no, this is not achieved. And if it's not achieved, you must be able to correct it very quickly. So you must make your acceptance criteria easy to understand and easy to sign off. The other one is the project constraints. Now, we talked about limits. So what would be the difference between a constraint and an assumption? We often have confusion between what a constraint is and what a consumption is, or an assumption. Earlier this evening, we agreed that one of the assumptions is making an ass out of you and me. So what would be the difference between a constraint and an assumption? Carlos talked about limits. And okay, Anthony, I'm going to give you the microphone again. Anthony's going to give me
I'm going to assume that a constraint is a specific boundary that you can't move around, or you've got to stay within a boundary. And an assumption is,
that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, making an assumption you don't know a specific.
Okay, so an assumption could be something like, and we'll see it in a little bit detail now, but assumption is something like a standard, all right, an industry standard. So let's say that we have to deliver something to this, and it isn't well defined. So what the project manager then says, well, he'll look around and he'll say, well, I don't really have a standard for this, and I don't have an acceptance criteria for this, so I'm going to assume that the standard that we're going to deliver this to is this particular industry standard. All right, so what you're actually doing with an assumption is that you're highlighting areas of the project that you actually assume. All right, so if you don't have a criteria for something there, you don't have a boundary for it, you don't have a constraint for it, you don't have something for it, you're going to highlight the assumption. You're going to say, well, we're assuming that we're going according to the standard. If you do that up front, then there cannot be arguments down the road when they say, but nobody said anything about this, what are we going to do? And that stops the arguments. Yes, Carlos, the assumption could be wrong, but that's where change control comes in. Okay, if you've got a good change control system and a configuration management system, then it's quite possible an assumption. Actually, when you're doing your detailed planning, you're often going to come across a lot of assumptions. So in your project scope, you might have that. So yes, it could be wrong. And an assumption, if you've made this up, but if you've highlighted the assumption up front, your client can't come back to you and say, hey, you didn't mention this. It'll either go as an assumption or it'll come as risks. So when you're identifying your risks, your assumptions are going to come out and you're going to mitigate them. You're going to see an assumption will become a risk. All right? Correct. The risk is higher. Yeah. Absolutely. So the risk is exactly what happens, is that your assumption actually ends up as being a hazard and it becomes a risk, and then you need to mitigate for them. So assumptions actually help you define your risks in a lot of ways. Right, so the other one is your initial project organization, such as a project board, the project manager, the project team, sub-teams, whatever your project organization is going to be, needs to be in your project scope, because that is actually how you're going to deliver something. And then, of course, in your project scope, you'll have your milestones and your cost estimation. How are you going to get, now this is a very important one. One of the most important things to do in your project scope is actually approval requirements. Okay, how and what is the delegated, what is delegated to what? Now that is absolutely critical, because when it comes to change control and you haven't got the right authority and someone signs off on that authority, what's going to happen is that the client's going to come back to you and say, well, who gave you that authority to do that? So right up front, you get agreement with your client to approval requirements. Okay, so if you make a change and it impacts the budget above a particular amount, then the client is going to sign it off. But on other ones, it doesn't affect the budget. It might affect the time, but not the overall time. It might affect lead times. Then maybe the project manager can sign it off. In fact, you might have a project team member signing off certain change requests because you don't want to be bothered with small things that aren't going to impact the overall outcome of a project. It might impact a particular phase, or it might impact a particular work, but there's enough slack time, there's enough other things in that project to not do this. Now, what I actually talked about when I was doing this one, and let's talk about it now, is that this construction company was moving the JSE from the center of Johannesburg to the posh new part of Johannesburg, which was now called Sandton, and they had some money left over. Okay, and so a change request was put in, right? Now, who's going to sign off on that? Who's the approval that's going to sign off? So if there's what they actually wanted to do is take the executive management and to save a lot of trouble, because they had the money to do it, what they were going to do is leave the furniture in the old building, leave the infrastructure in the old building, give them new computers and new infrastructure, new desks, all of that type of thing in the new building. What that actually meant was that they could actually get up, take their coat on a Friday afternoon, and on Monday morning, they just take their briefcase and their coat and they hang it up in the new building. All right. Now that was really nice and a really important factor for the senior management, because what you're actually doing is you're making it very easy for that senior management to actually recommend you in the future. Wow, this company had some money left over and they didn't take it for their own profit. They've actually plowed it back into the project, so their profit remains the same, and they were able to actually move us without impacting us. That's a feather in the cap for that organization. In fact, it was a very big it actually helped them a lot. So what actually happened was, who signed it off? Well, the CEO of that company actually signed it off through their right approval requirements. And who's going to sign off something? That was the CEO. Why? Because it did impact the profit. They could have had a better profit margin on the thing, but they were happy to go with their normal profit margin. I don't know how they got around their shareholders, but the CEO, that was the CEO's problem with that one. But the profit margin wasn't affected. So that could have happened. But I can assure you it was not the project manager that made that decision. But I'm pretty sure it was the project manager that initiated it and went to the board of the construction company and said, hey, let's do this. So anybody can bring it up. Now let's look at the work breakdown structure. It's still in the planning phase, and this is a very critical of the detailed planning of the project. This is where your project management software comes in. This is one of the tools that you're going to be using for the work breakdown structure is obviously your project management. That's where, and no, it's not taking parts off the old beetle. This one looks like it really is a breakdown structure. What is your work breakdown structure? Right, the first thing that we need to look here, it's always deliverable orientated. It's always deliverable orientated. and it's a decomposition, so it's hierarchical. So we start with a phase, or we start with an area, or we start with something. I'm going to show you some different ways of breaking down structures, but it is a decomposition until you get to a manageable, and that's my next point, to a manageable piece of work. Okay, that's actually what we're trying to get down to. We're going to break this down, we're going to decompose it, if you like, until it gets to a manageable piece of work. Now, work breakdown structure also defines the total scope of the project. So what you've got is your milestones, and it's going to come down to a way that you can actually have a work package that is small enough to manage and small enough not to have an impact if something goes wrong with it. All right, so it must be small enough that it doesn't have an impact. So it's an action of a small group that it doesn't have an impact over the overall project. Now, if you only broke down it into 3 milestones, then the likelihood of your project not succeeding is very, very high. Because if something goes wrong with what's doing it, it's not a manageable size. So the smaller the package of work, the easier it is to manage. Okay. So that's where we are with that one. So these packages should be small enough also to be able to be scheduled and estimated and monitored and controlled. All right, which is what I've already said. So just remember that they must be able to be scheduled, they must be able to be estimated, you must be able to monitor them in a way. So you must be able to say it's 20% done, 30% done, 100% done. And if it's going out, can we control it? If something goes wrong with this, how can we control it? What's the impact on the other work packages? All right, so it's really the divide and conquer approach, isn't it? It's a divide and conquer approach. The work breakdown subject contains all the project work tasks. Now, let's look at some of these things. Firstly, it's a monitoring tool for the status of assigned work. It's derived from your project schedule, defines all the tasks that need to be performed, and any work by the project team must be part of that work breakdown structure. It's obvious. If you've got a project team member, he has to be assigned or accountable for pieces of that work. And then it needs to be updated periodically. So your work breakdown structure that's why we use project management software for this, because it's easy to go to that one. But it's also where you're going to put your Gantt charts and your network diagrams and your critical path, and all of those things come into your project management. So good one gives you good resource leveling. So this is a place where you can see whether you've overutilized resources and underutilized resources. It's also a good place to see which is the critical path. What are the things we've got to watch? The project manager needs to watch the critical path. What are those things that are going to impact them? So, and you've got some project management tools actually make it very easy to define the critical path. That actually does it for you. A management tool that provides the ability to assess assignment of work. So that's what we see in the work breakdown structure. Now, to create the work breakdown structure, we need the following inputs. All right, we need the scope management plan, we need the organization assets, process assets, we need the scope statement, we need the project change requests, we need approval change requests, and what we come out with are these things. All right, so what are the tools? Some of the tools that we will use: work breakdown structure templates, a decomposition diagram, the contents, all work deliverables for the project or product development, and project management. So let's look at some of the outputs. There's our work breakdown structure. We have a scope baseline. All right, and we have a work breakdown structure dictionary. Now I'm going to ask the question here because I asked it earlier. Can anybody tell me what a work breakdown structure dictionary is? Come on, I'm not moving on until somebody tells me what that is. Now, these things are quite important because it's part of the assessment when you look at some of these things. What is a work breakdown structure dictionary. Please help me out. Anybody help me out? Okay. Funny, hey, we don't often use that term, do we? We don't often use that term. There we are. It is terminology. All right. Carlos has given us part of it. Let me read to you the definition of this, because it's quite important that you're going to need to get it. A work breakdown structure definition is a document that describes each component of the work breakdown structure. For each work breakdown structure component, the work breakdown structure dictionary includes a brief definition or a scope of that statement of work. So that little piece of work has got a scope statement. It defines the deliverables. It gives a list of associated activities for it. It lists the impact on various milestones and other information that may include the responsible organization if you outsource it, the start and the end dates, the resources that are required for it, the cost estimate, the charge. All these things are actually put into your project management anyway, isn't it? So if you've got a good project management tool and the activity details, yes, the definitions of the tasks to be performed is what Anthony's got there. So all of these things are in that dictionary. So it's actually, every work package has got some of these things in them. Now you're going to say, well, do you really need to have that in a small project? No. And I was actually asked that question last time, so I want to just come back to you and tell you that I think it's on page 46. Let me go to page 46 of Project Management Principles by Stephen Hartley. Let me just check if it was on page 46. Yes. No, it wasn't page 46. It was page 48. On page 48, because on the last one they said, are you really going to do that on every project? So I said, well, I think that this is a good way to look at it. If you look on page 48 of your textbook, you will see that Stephen Hartley has actually outlined some criteria that you'd need, whether it's a lean project, a light project, or a large project. All right, so he classifies it into three. And he says, well, this is a lean project, this is a light project, and this is a large project. And in the governance structures, he's going to say, well, you need these type of things in the size of the project that you want. So no, although I'm telling you what needs to be done in a very large project, some of this paperwork probably does not need to take place. In other words, you've probably got it on a medium-sized project, you've probably got enough. If you were using a good project-based tool, project management-based tool, such as MS Project or Project Scheduler or ASPA or Primavera, you would probably have enough, or Primavera would have a very good work breakdown structure dictionary, by the way, so I probably should just tell you that. But the other project management tools have enough within there not to have to worry about a dictionary, because there is enough information in there to do it. All right. Now, what is the importance of a baseline? If you update the scope statement and you update the scope management plan and you take into consider change requests, now when we're creating a work breakdown structure, we're talking about detailed planning. It's obvious that you might want to change your project charter. The reason is it's two different phases of the project. So when you initiated a project and you get to the stage and you suddenly say, hey, in defining this, I have to make some changes, you need to remandate. So you take that back to your client and you say, I'm going to change my project charter. Please have a look at this now and tell me whether it's acceptable to you. All right, so there are some things that you need to do. Okay, so here are some work breakdown structures. This one is organized into work packages. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. This is how most projects are defined. Here's a way that most projects will be. So you'll have a phase 1, you'll have a phase 2, and you could right at the top there have a deliverable 3, a sub-project, and then deliverables under it. So this is a typical work breakdown structure based on work packages. However, that's not the only way to do it. For example, this one is organized in phases, including the project management phase. So that project management phase is your project meetings and your administration. You have project requirements, and they all run at the same time. They could run in parallel. You're having your detailed design, you're constructing, so each one of these are running at the same time. It's a different way of breaking it down. You've got different phases or different aspects of it. Doesn't mean to say that it doesn't have to be broken down that way. You can break down your work breakdown in multiple ways. This one is organized in phases. Now, the final one that we're going to show you is, let's take an aircraft system. There you have the project management part of it. You have training, you have data, you have the air vehicles itself, and this is another way. So this one was broken down into deliverables. Each one of those areas has a particular deliverable, and you're measuring the deliverables. Okay, they might all run even at the same time, in parallel perhaps, but the deliverable is what is the way that it is broken down. And so there are multiple ways of breaking down your project. Now, before we get on to scope verification, let me just make two things that are really important in project scope. Your first one is your authority, and the second one is the criteria. Your acceptance criteria and your authority are the two most important things that you get upfront, and you define upfront, especially if you are in an area where it is a functional organization, because that is where you're going to be challenged. Now, the challenge is going to come when you start monitoring and you start making changes to the plan. All right? So, let me ask a question now. What is the importance of a baseline, or why is the baseline so important in your work breakdown structure? Why is the project baseline important? Last night on the second session, I think it's because it's later. I'm not so responsive. Please help me. What is important about a baseline? Right. There we go. Thank you, Anthony. Sure. Thank you. Okay, what do you think is
important about the baseline is it actually gives you the determined starting point at the initial design phase, and you can carry out through the whole project.
Yes. Okay, because what it came out in my previous session was I said, okay, so you make a change, and you'll see that come just now. You make a change, and you get a new baseline. I said, yes, but your original baseline stays there because that's your starting point. It's a fantastic tool to see how far you get off of this, because it's going to come to a point, it could come to a point in your project that the changes impact the project so much that your client stops saying, hey, we need to do something here. All right? And there have been, and I've seen projects actually terminated because of the changes being so far from your baseline. But it's such a good tool for a project manager to actually look at, because your baseline has got your cost to it, it's got your time to it, and it's got your deliverables to it. So those three things are there on your baseline. And that's the tool that you're going to use for scope verification and for scope monitoring. So you'll see that those come in to these things here. So your deliverables are there, your scope statement is there, your scope management plan is there. Your scope management plan, that includes your change requests, your approvals, your acceptance criteria. All of those are in your scope management plan. Your work breakdown dictionary, that is there. All right, and that's going to help us. So the tools we're going to use, obviously, is inspection, but it's also what comes out of here are accepted variable deliverables. All right, so you've got your acceptance criteria, and you're going to get it signed off, and they sign it off, and it's done. All right, requested changes. So if we make changes to the request and we update our baseline and we get a new baseline, doesn't mean to say the other baseline doesn't stay where it is. We just get a version 2 of it. and then we get recommended corrective action. Okay, so those are the outputs of our verification. Now let's look at scope control. Scope control has got these following inputs. Okay, it is our work breakdown structure again. So you see, it's very important, the work breakdown structure. The work breakdown dictionary is all that information that is in there, your project scope statement, and now your work performance information. What is work performance information? Okay, work performance information is going to help you in your control. So it's going to define some of the things that you need to do to actually perform that work. For example, your calendar is very important. Okay, climatic things for changes and weather is very important for work performance. You cannot work in certain weather in some projects. All right. So it is those factors that are going to impact your work performance. Right, so scope control has got that. What happens if we have too many rainy days? You're going to have a change control. I can tell you that now, because what you've done is you've extended the time. So there are natural things that are going to cause delays in the project. And so work performance information is those that are going to affect the performance of actually the activities of your project. Now, if we go into that one, we look at some of the outputs of scope control. And that is the update to the scope statement, the update to the baseline, updates to your work breakdown structure in your dictionary, and including your project management plan. So this is where we got into that discussion about baselines and why you would change or not change your baseline. You don't change your baseline, you just make a new version of it. And of course it gets tighter and tighter as you make it. Every variation to your baseline is going to cause concern at some stage. So let's go on to the next one. What tools are we going to use to do it? Well, it's your change control system. Your variance analysis, and that's why your baselines are so important. And another tool is actually replanning. So depending on your depending on who's going to sign off on a change, you need to replan. If it's going to have an overall impact on the project, then that replanning needs to go right back to the project charter, and your client needs to relook at it. Your configuration management is that if something changes on there's equipment changes or something like that, that needs to be recorded somewhere. All right. So let's look at some of the tools in individual. Let's take an anatomy of the change. So a change is needed for some reason. All right. So what happens is the next part of that one is that you create a change request, and obviously you're going to get the change approved at the required level, and then you're going to do your variance analysis and see what is the impact of that change, and then you're going to look and replan the work, and then you're going to create a new baseline. Right. So that's normally what happens with change control and a change. So that is the anatomy of a change. Your variance analysis is the difference between the actual and the baseline. And obviously every new baseline that you put in gives you an opportunity to check your variance. The replanning is really important to see, and to see the impact of the change that you're actually managing. So when you replan, you're going to look at the overall impact of the whole of the project, because it may change your critical path. It may do other strange things. So replanning is critical at that one. And your configuration management is to store that information about those deliverables already made, and the changes that you're going to make so it's you need to be able to store it somewhere for lessons learned and for tracking your changes. Now, here's a question, and I'm not moving on until we get a good answer on this one. So you're going to do it. All right. Let's see if we've done something right on this one. Okay. Which answer is it? A, B, or C? Come on, I want everybody just to put on your answer on the thing there. You can just type in your answer. A, B, or C, or D. Come on, guys. Put it down there. Let's see if we get the majority. Which one of the majority is going to say? C. Thank you, Dottie. Okay. D. C. A. Oh dear. All right. I think of the last one, they all copied each other. At least I've got some differences here. All right. C is actually the right answer. All right. So yes, A could be right, but your scope verification, A could be right as well. But the actual answer was C. That one came out of one of the project management guides that I had. So there we are. That also means that I'm finished for tonight, so I'm going to leave it open now to ask you any questions that you have. Do you have any questions? We have about 5 minutes left of the session. I hope that I've tried to make it clear as possible. Are there anything that you'd like to ask at the moment? Anything you'd like to ask about? Anything, actually, in project management? Any questions? Auntie, could you advise us on how we download the presentations? Yes. I finished putting them up today. They basically are linked to project scope. So if you went into PMG511 and you look under core learning, you'll find the links of the previous ones all there. So the previous, okay, the introduction one is not there, but the part 1 and part 2 of integrated processes is there, and you will find them there. So you can go back and see them now. This one will go up. It will go up in PMG 502B. 502A, sorry, 502A instead of 501A. So this link should be up tomorrow morning. So you can go back through the presentations. I'd like some feedback on the presentations. If I can improve on it, I'd really like to improve on them. So please give me some feedback on them. I am going to ask you to fill in some feedback forms in a little while. When we start on some of these, I'm going to ask you to fill in some feedback forms. We need to improve, so please just help me by giving some feedback. Right, are there any other questions? Now, someone did ask me earlier, so because we've got such a different group here on the second session, I will just repeat some of those questions. Yes, Carlos, I will give a recording of the session, and I will provide the link in that tomorrow morning. You will have that link. The other links are already in PMG 501A. This one will be, it will, when you're doing the recording, it's got a different link. So I will just put the link there, and I will just, you'll just be able to click on it if you go into Moodle or into the learning management system. The question that was asked earlier this evening that might be of help, and they said to me, the integrated process is really a large part of it is planning, but it's also got some of the other parts of the process which they haven't done yet. So I said to them that it would be important that if you've got planned part of your assessments that you want to get in now, and you're actually doing a project as as we're going through these sessions. In other words, you're doing a project or we're simulating a project that we're going through. You're really going to have all your evidence come in at the stage of doing the project. So when you start monitoring that and you start having the evidence for that one, you can actually put it in. So the integrated process might end up as being the last, where you're going to put up the last piece of your evidence. So it might be the last thing that gets assessed, and that's not a crime. We don't have to be. It was just easier to do the integrated process first, but from an assessment perspective, it's probably easier to have the integrated assessment last. But you're going to see the same with the scope management. Some of the things are not going to be so easy to be able to measure until you've actually done a scope change or done evidence for a scope change. So if you're busy with a project and you can provide that evidence, great. If you're just starting on the project now, well, we can wait a while until you've done those pieces of it. So I hope that makes sense. Any more questions? No more questions. Any more questions? All right, then I'm going to say good night. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. It's good to see you all. And we'll see you next week. Good night. Thank you.